All right, hello everyone. This is Mary Collier. I'm the Professional Development Program Manager at the Ontario Museum Association, and I am once again very happy to welcome you to the third webinar in our summer series on climate control. What do you really need? So can you guys just let me know if you can hear me just in the chat? Say yes if I'm coming through okay. Excellent. Thank you, everyone. All right, so we are very pleased to partner with the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport to present this Learning Lab summer series focused on supporting museums with the Ministry's standards for community museums in Ontario. So at the OMA, we've been working with the Ministry to provide resources relating to the standards at our website, and you can get to the CMOG Standards Resources page from our homepage. If you haven't checked back lately, the recordings and slide decks from our last several webinars are now available on the CMOG Standards Resources page. So if you need to revisit any of those or share them with any of your colleagues, please visit that page. And we're particularly pleased that this continued partnership with the Ministry allows us to present the summer series of webinars on collections, conservation, education and interpretation, exhibition, and physical plant standards. So the OMA has planned these webinars with subject matter experts to provide information on best practice, but also to provide a venue for you to connect with your museum and heritage advisors from the Ministry so you can have any questions answered specific to the standards themselves. So this is the third webinar in our summer series, but we have several more webinars in the works for the summer, so you can sign up for those from our website at museumsontario.com as well. So we are going to have over 50 people with us today, so that's a fantastic turnout once again. If there's anybody new on the webinar today, I just want to make sure that everyone knows how to participate. So first of all, you should know that the slides that you can see from this webinar will be available on the CMOG Standards Resources page of the OMA website, along with the recording of the webinar, so you don't need to worry about writing down every word you see. You can sit back, eat your sandwich, and just take it all in. So you'll be able to see the slides and hear the presenters speak. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, simply type your message into the chat box at the bottom of the screen and click send. If you don't want everyone to see your question, you can ask it privately only to the presenters by using the send to drop-down menu and selecting all presenters. So I'm going to be monitoring the chat, and we'll do our best to ensure that all of your questions are answered today. But we just have just over an hour, so if there's anything we don't get to in this webinar that is still a burning question for you, please do identify it in your evaluation. So as you can see in the agenda, after this intro, I'm going to pass the mic over to Fiona Graham, who is our presenter today. And please feel free to ask her any questions about the content of the webinar during her presentation. And then after Fiona's presentation, there will be 15 minutes for Q&A with Elke Weinstein from the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport, and she'll be able to answer questions specifically about the conservation standard itself. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an introduction to Fiona. Fiona Graham is a conservator specializing in preventive conservation. She has a master's degree in art conservation artifacts from Queen's University and is accredited by the Canadian Association of Professional Conservators and the Canadian Association of Professional Heritage Consultants. She's worked at a number of museums, as well as the Canadian Conservation Institute and the Centre de Conservation du Québec. She's worked for the Department of Canadian Heritage as a collections preservation advisor, helping museums obtain MAP grants and MCP designation. At the Ministry of Culture, she was the conservation advisor and then the museum advisor for Eastern and Northeastern Ontario. During that time, she managed the 2000 revision of the standards for community museums in Ontario, so she has an intimate knowledge of how they work. Fiona has also been a course director for the OMA's Care of Collections course since 1999 and teaches the conservation course as part of Athabasca University's Heritage Resource Management program. She's currently an associate with Goldsmith Borgal Company Ltd architects based in Toronto, where she's involved in museum and heritage preservation projects, and is a veteran webinar presenter, as we saw last week. So I'll let Fiona take it from here.
Okay, everybody, let me know or let Mary know by typing in the text chat if I'm speaking too softly or too loudly. And I'm a little bit blah today, so I hope I'll wake up as we get into the exciting topic of climate control. Here we go. Okay, we're going to start out with an introduction about this this particular webinar. Then we're going to look at what the standards themselves say about environmental levels and control in your museums. Then we're going to have a look at what research says about the subject. We're going to talk about how to monitor climate and how to control it, and then we'll have time for any final questions at the end. I've selected one in particular from the group that we got with the registration applications that I thought was particularly apropos. So let's get going. The purpose of this particular webinar is an attempt to clarify one of the most misunderstood aspects of conservation in Ontario's community museums. It's an introduction to current thinking on the matter of climate control in museums, and it is based on responses to the Conservation Standard Questionnaire and in part to the Physical Standard Questionnaire. I have tried to respond to as many of your questions as I can in the body of this webinar. In some cases, I'll be referring you to other resources. You'll see as we go along. So what does the Conservation Standard say about climate in museums? Item 6C says that it's important to maintain relative humidity and temperature levels within an appropriate range for museum artifacts. And what you may not have noticed is that there is a footnote there. It's turned into an end note instead of a footnote, so it's kind of hard to find at the very end of the standards, but this is an important point. If you go to the end note, it says an acceptable range is normally 40 to 60%, and this condition applies to all buildings physically capable of maintaining these standards and to all additions to existing buildings or sites. Some buildings, because of structural or historical considerations, may require that this range be adjusted. Such adjustments must be based on individual assessments carried out in consultation with ministry technical staff. That was when the ministry had technical staff. So Elka is now your your technical staff. Poor Elka. She has to cover absolutely everything now. Okay. So that's what it says about levels, which is actually really reasonable, and that's what it said in the original standard in 1981. Just to let you know that we didn't change that in 2000. We kept it the same because it was actually a very reasonable and practical suggestion. What else does the Conservation Standard say about environment? Well, it says implementing a program of regular checking and recording of environmental conditions with follow-up procedures to correct deficiencies. And again, very reasonable, not too onerous. We'll get to that in a bit. And under the Physical Plant Standard, item 3 says the museum ensures that each of its buildings meets environmental norms appropriate to its functions. And there's another one of those little footnotes. Where a museum has yet to fully meet these requirements, the ministry will accept an implementation schedule outlining the work to be done. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with that as a result of the feedback from the ministry on those questionnaires. Okay, so that's what the standards say. Let's just remind ourselves about what we're actually talking about here in the scope of preventive conservation in general. We're talking about incorrect temperature and incorrect relative humidity as being the particular agents of deterioration. So these are just two in a list of 10 other things. We're highlighting them here because, as I mentioned at the beginning, they tend to have the most confusion associated with them in terms of what do we need and how do we get there. And I do recommend, for more information and really good explanation about what this means for your collections, to go to the Canadian Conservation Institute website, and the information is there. It's a little bit hard to find. You have to go to the Caring for Collections link, and then under that to the 10 Agents of Deterioration link, and then you can pick whichever agent of deterioration you happen to be interested in that day. But it's very good, it's very up to date, and they are written with museums of all sizes in mind. So that's an important thing to know. Okay, so what does the research now tell us about temperature and relative humidity's effects on collections? For those of you who took the webinar last week, this slide will look familiar. Inappropriate temperature. What does inappropriate mean? Well, we say inappropriate temperature, first of all, because obviously temperature in and of itself is not a bad thing, it just is. What we have to distinguish what temperatures are going to cause problems for different types of artifacts and collections. So sometimes the temperature will be too high for certain collections. A temperature that is too high will increase the rate of chemical degradation. In fact, we know that every time you increase the temperature by 5 degrees, you have the lifetime of the collection of the material in question. So this is particularly important. We're talking about organic materials such as paper or textiles. And also plastics, all of modern electronic carriers in particular. Also, there are physical problems associated with temperatures that are too high. It softens glues and waxes, for example, and it can deform records and magnetic media. Some people will say that what about temperatures that are too low? Well, the good news is that temperatures that are too low are actually seldom a problem. Cold, for the most part, is very good for collections. It slows down their natural processes of degradation. There are only a few types of things that you don't want to get too cold, especially you don't want to freeze. Things that become really brittle and therefore it becomes dangerous to move them if they're really cold. Most paintings, encaustic, acrylic, and oil paintings, it's a good idea to take those out of areas that could freeze. And fossils and rocks, and the reason those are in there is that if there's any moisture trapped inside the body of the rock or the fossil, it freezes, obviously we know, when water freezes it expands, and you can get cracks, explosions if you're really lucky and something dramatic happens, but it's not a good thing to freeze fossils and rocks on principle. The other thing that other type of inappropriate temperature people ask about is fluctuating temperature, and this is one of those things that goes into the realm of the confusing, because fluctuating temperature is really only a problem in the sense that if it causes the relative humidity to fluctuate, fluctuating temperature in and of itself doesn't actually do anything bad to collections. It's only when it's creating fluctuations in relative humidity that are too large and that the particular materials can't handle. So the point I want you to get out of this slide is that for the most part, when we're talking about temperature, cooler is better, and that don't worry so much about temperature fluctuations. Just a reminder, for those of you who haven't seen this for a long time since your conservation training, when temperature increases, relative humidity decreases, and vice versa. That's the relationship between the two. So what is a good temperature? Most of our museums, we keep human comfort levels for our own sake, and that's quite appropriate for most materials. So The only the collections where lower temperatures are really beneficial, I've given a list of them there. Most plastics, acidic paper, most forms of film and photographic prints, especially color photographic prints. If they do benefit quite significantly from cold storage, but otherwise, for the most part, human comfort levels are appropriate for museum collections. We're getting a question about how high the air conditioner should be in Fahrenheit in the summertime. Who's got their Fahrenheit to Celsius converter headset on? It can be pretty high. I would from the point of view of the collections, I would set it as low as possible for the you're comfortable, but not so low as that you're freezing people, and also we get into this issue of whether to keep it running through the night or not. So that's also something you might want to consider. I'll get into that a little bit later, but it's the temperature at which you set your air conditioner is not doesn't make a huge difference to the collection. Okay, so what does inappropriate relative humidity consist of? The most important one for most of us is relative humidity that's too high. In other words, it's damp. Shelley's telling us that 25 degrees C is about 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Thank you, Shelley. So that would be the upper limit. Warmer than that, and you get I think your visitors might start complaining. But okay, so inappropriate relative humidity, damp conditions are something we want to avoid. That usually consists of anything over 75% for most materials. You get mold, metal corrosion, buckling veneers, and you'll get films and photoprints start to stick together if they're stacked. Some types of collections have the need for very specific relative humidities that are different from other things in a mixed collection. If you have archaeological metals, they're probably contaminated with salts, and they are very prone to corrosion even at fairly low relative humidities. So we try and keep the relative humidity for those metals as low as possible. If you have any unstable glass, that's glass that's chemically unstable. It can be cloudy or iridescent. It can have a crack pattern on it. It's one of those materials that needs very specific relative humidity in the mid-range. We usually achieve that with microclimates, which I'll get into later. Certain minerals need a very specific relative humidity, and it's basically any relative humidity other than the specific one that they need is inappropriate for these types of materials. Fluctuating relative humidity. This is where there's a lot of research done over the last 20 years to give us a better idea of what is actually damaging versus what we think might be damaging. What happened is that people erred on the side of caution. So the tolerances got tighter and tighter and tighter, so that you got to the point where people were recommending a relative humidity of plus or minus 2.5%. You won't see that, I don't think, anywhere today. You will sometimes see people requiring plus or minus 5%. That means that the relative humidity is allowed to fluctuate. For example, if it's set at 50, it's allowed to go up to 55 and down to 45. That's plus or minus 5. A fluctuation. Some collections I'll get to this in a bit, will be do need tighter tolerances than others. However, the vast majority of collections in Ontario community museums, and I'm not talking art galleries here, are okay with a fluctuation of plus or minus 10 or even plus or minus 20. So, and when we're talking fluctuations, that includes seasonal as well as shorter term, which means anything shorter than seasonal. The thing with fluctuations is that some artifacts are affected negatively by short-term fluctuations, but not by longer-term fluctuations. So something that if in one day your humidity goes from 50% to 30%, might not like that. But it would be fine if that transition occurred over the space of a month, for example. But something else, if that transition occurs over one day, it wouldn't be affected, but it would be affected if it was over months. And this is what we deal with when we try and set relative humidity guidelines for collections as opposed to individual artifacts. So there are always instances where individual artifacts may need something different, and that's where we go to microclimates. In the last session, I mentioned that low humidity is not a problem for collections as a whole, and that's true. The only, I should have given a caveat though, is that it is a problem in the sense that if you handle material that's at a really low humidity, and for example papers or older textiles, they may be quite stiff and brittle at lower humidities. Their chemical degradation has been slowed down, but they become more fragile. So that is one caution. With low humidity is good, but if you're accessing a collection frequently, for example during the winter, then you may not want to go below 30%, for example, because you'll get into problems with handling those materials. So what's an appropriate relative humidity after all of that? Most collections in Ontario's community museums will tolerate a relative humidity in the range of 30 to 70%. And that would be 50% plus or minus 20. And if you see, that's actually a little bit broader than what the standard says of 40 to 60, but because this is 13 years on since that standard was last revised, but it's pretty darn close. We were ahead of our time in putting together the last set of standards, and certainly our predecessors were really ahead of their time putting together the original ones. Note that art galleries have different needs. I got to say that, as I said, for practical reasons, what we're trying to do here is provide appropriate conditions for the collection as a whole, not for one artifact at a time. And what you may need to do is provide microclimates for things like freshly conserved or newly executed paintings, furniture, and other painted and or wooden artifacts, which will be more sensitive to fluctuations, in particular in relative humidity. Artifacts that may be freshly arrived from more humid environments, such as furniture from England or wooden sculpture from Indonesia. That's two very specific examples, but just to give you an idea. You will find if the first time they go through a winter in a centrally heated Canadian Ontario building, the chances are they will crack. And also the special cases mentioned in slide 13. Who might ask you for tighter controls in this? Well, lending institutions, particularly national institutions that for reasons of sort of international peer pressure, if nothing else, are moving more slowly than the rest of us to acknowledge what the actual needs of collections are. Don't be surprised if you want to borrow something from a major gallery or museum if they require tighter levels, and if you can't provide them in your room or your building, then you may have to do something in terms of a display case, for example. Can you example of each? Sorry, I'm looking at a question here. An example of a material that can sustain short-term fluctuation. Yeah, very, very good. Okay, something really bulky like a heavy-duty, sturdy piece of furniture is an example of an artifact that will not react to a drastic shift in relative humidity over, say, a 24-hour period or even a week-long period. However, if it happens over the course of 2 weeks or a month, it is more likely to have a problem. It's just it's the time factor in terms of how long it takes for that for the change to get in and out of the material and react. An example of an artifact that would react poorly to a drastic fluctuation in the course of a day would be a small piece of ivory sculpture, maybe an Inuit carving, something like that. And yet, if you spread that fluctuation out over a week, 2 weeks, a month, it would be able to absorb the change much more readily and would probably not crack. So it's got to do with the thinner the material, as a general rule of thumb, the thinner the material, the worse are the short-term fluctuations, and the thicker the material, the worse are the longer-term fluctuations. Excuse my grammar, that was really poorly put. Okay, another place that might ask for tighter controls are some of the federal heritage programs, such as movable cultural property, cultural spaces, the traveling exhibitions indemnification program, but they're gradually loosening their requirements as well, not just because of what collections really need, but also just as a response to global climate concerns. There's a lot of high-level meetings going on around the world between the major institutions about how to do a better job of taking care of our world environment while we're also taking care of our cultural collections. And as I said, microclimates are a very reasonable alternative to achieving tight tolerances at the building or room level. And I promise I will talk about microclimates and show you pictures. Here we are. Somebody is talking about a okay, how do I see the whole one again? Click on it. Ah, yeah, there we go. What happens if HVAC system is shut down every day for 14 hours? And it can cause a 5% fluctuation in over a 24-hour period. How concerned should we be? Excellent question. I would say that it really depends on what you've got in your collection. If you have a collection that has been going through that for the last however many months or years, that same fluctuation, basically anything that's going to happen to your collection has already happened to it. It's already responded, it's already in a way it's been proofed against that particular environment. Your problems will occur if you have anything restored or conserved, particularly anything like a painting or something made of wood, where you may be reintroducing those stresses that have been released previously, or if you have new acquisitions that for some reason have been in really super controlled environments. Otherwise, in general, like I say, I don't know your collection, but I would think that it would 5% fluctuation is pretty darn good. So that's my answer. Okay. So what does your collection need? This is a nice little list that I got from a presentation given by Michael C. Henry, and I've got the reference later on in this webinar, and it'll be up on the website. So I won't go through the whole list, but basically it's just know your collection, know what it's gone through before, what kind of housing you have. If you have everything in acid-free boxes, for example, or enclosed cabinets, it's going to have a lot less reaction to changes in relative humidity, for example, than something that's out in the open. What are your access requirements? And that goes exactly to that question of is it okay to have really low relative humidity over the winter period? If you're not accessing that material, really low relative humidity is actually not a problem at all. If you are accessing it, then you may have to rethink that. Okay, there we go. And then understanding your building and finding out what it can provide. This is the next piece in the puzzle. This is a fairly lengthy list. I'll just summarize it by saying that you need to know what your building envelope is capable of. This is where you probably need to talk to a mechanical engineer or an architect, because depending on what your walls and windows and roof and foundation are, you may not be able to add much humidity in the winter, even if you wanted to, for example. So that's you have to know your building. You have to know what other uses your building may be put to, and you may or may not have as much as control as you may like on the over things like temperature and humidity. So that all has to be taken into account. Use your space, the space that you do have, effectively. If you have different collections with different needs, and you have different rooms with different conditions, try to match the collection to the right room. For example, it's true we tend to say don't put stuff in the attic, but if you have a hot, dry attic and you have a collection of metal artifacts, it's okay to put them in the attic. If you have your archives in the attic, you might want to take those out of the attic, because one of the top risks for those materials, relatively speaking, is high temperatures. So that would be not a good idea to store those things in the attic. So we had a question earlier about whether it's a problem to have uneven temperature from one area of the building to another. It's not a problem for collections. That's an issue for staff and visitors, and yes, many of us have lived that. You're broiling in one corner and freezing in another. Nobody's happy. But I'm not saying it's not a problem, it's just not a problem for collections. Where you in terms of uneven relative humidity from one area of the building to another, it shouldn't really be problematic unless the difference is greater than 40% or so, which is really unlikely. If it's a 5-10% difference. If you have materials that are really sensitive to relative humidity fluctuations, like if you have a collection of ivory miniatures and you need to transfer them from one room to another, you can always just wrap them up in buffering layers in boxes, lots of tissue, blankets, and let them acclimatize for a while before unpacking them. So it's not one of those things where I would look at rejigging your entire environmental control system just to get exactly the same conditions in every single room. What about fabrics and furs and relative humidity and temperature? Very good question. You may have be familiar with the practice of keeping especially furs in low temperature environments. That is because it's more of a pest control issue than a relative humidity issue. So it does have the added benefit of keeping the relative humidity a little bit higher, which is not a bad thing for furs or taxidermy, but the main reason we like to keep those types of collections in cold storage is actually to discourage pests. So if that's where that question is coming from, I'm not sure. Certainly fabrics, they're the same as paper in the sense that they benefit from lower temperature and lower relative humidity because it slows down their natural chemical degradation. But if they're being accessed frequently, you don't want to get the relative humidity too low, because then you get into the problem of when you handle them, they can be a little brittle and you can get fiber breakage that way. So hope that answers that. And photographic negatives definitely benefit from being in lower temperature environments. The older they are, the cellulose, nitrate and cellulose acetate ones definitely should be in cold storage if you can manage it. The more modern ones, the polyester based carriers, it's less critical, but they do benefit from being in cold storage. And again, the relative humidity low is fine as long as they're not being handled regularly. Okay. Understand the environmental context. Yeah, this is just this is about monitoring your interior environment, knowing what your exterior environment is, and knowing what if you have an existing heating, cooling system, what it's capable of in terms of delivering temperatures and if there is any humidity control at all. Obviously, you need to think about the costs and whether your institution can manage them. Capital and operating, they each they each have to be looked at. Interesting thing is with operating costs, if you the majority of your operating costs go to heating and cooling, not to relative humidity control, even if you have that. So by broadening your your range of acceptable temperature, if it's currently at say 18 to 21, if you can broaden that a little bit on either end or on both ends, you will start to see cost savings for energy right away. Which is very interesting. If you're thinking about upgrading your environmental control system, you do have to think about how fancy a system you want to get based depending on where you're located and how readily available you have the expertise is to maintain it. Okay, yeah, the more complicated the system, the more likely it is to break down, and systems that break down are often worse than having no systems at all. And that's not just me talking, that's a general engineering principle. Okay, so monitoring is one of the first things you have to do. In fact, it is the first thing you have to do. You have to know what conditions you have. You can't assume you know what conditions you have. Our bodies are really good at telling us what temperature it is, but not very good at telling us what the relative humidity is unless it's super high. So obviously if you have moisture running down your walls, you can be pretty sure you have a high relative, overly high relative humidity. But monitoring is something you have to do first before you try and change anything. And just a quick word about monitoring versus controlling. People often use these terms interchangeably, but they're very different. Monitoring is the measuring and recording. Controlling is actually adjusting the temperature and the humidity. So first you monitor, then you identify the causes, and then you can control them. For example, if you have a damp basement, do you go right ahead and dehumidify it, or do you find out the cause and maybe fix the foundation, and maybe you don't have to dehumidify it? Okay, so just a quick overview of monitoring equipment. There's two basic kinds. There's non-recording kinds and recording kinds. So the non-recording, you have to actually write down the measurements. So you'll have a record and then you can assess what's happening. So there's very inexpensive hygrometers and thermohygrometers. They really should be checked against calibrated instruments, because their quality is really iffy. Some of them are better than others, but you won't know that until you actually check it. So borrow a good machine from another organization. CCI has a lending program, for example, to check the accuracy of, if you are just relying on those kind of instruments. If you have an old motorized psychrometer, great, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you don't go out and buy one, but unless it's very cheap, because they are extremely good and extremely reliable, the motorized ones. The swing psychrometers, which are certain facilities managers' favorite toys ever, are notoriously unreliable, because you get different readings depending on who's swinging them around. So I really wouldn't rely on that. And then there's the handheld electronic monitors, which are very expensive, or relatively expensive, but they're excellent for spot checks, and you can use them for calibrating other instruments. So those are good things to borrow if you to check your own instruments. Hygrothermographs, they're relatively expensive, and you need to change the charts, but there's no software required. You see exactly what's going on right away. Then the other type of recording monitors are data loggers, which are moderately expensive, but they do have remote capabilities for those of you who are interested in that, and you do need to download the data. But the software that comes with each of them tends to be very simple, at least the ones that I've seen. Okay, so now you know what you're aiming for. You know you're monitoring, and now how do you fix it if there's something wrong? Well, the one piece of good news here, well, there's lots of good news, but is that if there are obstacles to protecting your collections at one level, you may be able to intervene at a different level. So all of you who have issues because you have no control over your site or your building, for example, because it belongs to somebody else, you may be able to do what you need to do to give better controls on a room-by-room level, or even at the level of a display case or a storage box. So don't panic, and also don't forget your policies and procedures. Like that thing I mentioned about, if you have uneven relative humidity between different parts of your building, you instead of going to the expense of trying to fix it so that everything is exactly the same, you could have a procedure in place so that if you have to move something sensitive from one part to the other, that you pack it up with lots of buffering material, and then you have an acclimation period. So if the relative humidity is too high, obviously you need to locate the source of the moisture. I won't go into detail here. You can read it yourself. Maintenance, inspections. You can, one of the things that is very interesting to try, especially in historic houses, is you can smart ventilate, which will introduce outside air when the exterior conditions are drier. And basically what this involves is that your fan unit is connected to a humidistat instead of a thermostat. So it responds to, if the humidity is higher inside than it is outside, it'll turn on the fan and bring in the cooler air from outside. So it's a pretty straightforward system and not too expensive, and it works nicely. You can increase the temperature slightly and that will bring the humidity down. That's a really good winter option for seasonal museums, is to have a heater on attached to a humidistat instead of a thermostat. So when the relative humidity gets above a certain level, the heater switches on. When it reaches when it dries out the air sufficiently, the heater switches off. Using air conditioning in the summer is nice. Most air conditioning systems work by taking the moisture out of the air. Installing dehumidifiers either as part of a central system or as portable units is the obvious way that most people go when dealing with high or damp conditions. Other things you can do just for your collections to limit damage if you have damp conditions is you can keep collections away from exterior walls and cold damp floors. There's a nice little diagram here that I stole from the Canadian Conservation Institute chapter on incorrect relative humidity. What they don't mention in that chapter is something that a lot of conservators have noticed, is that if collections are dirty, they tend to start to grow moldy or corroded faster in damp conditions. So a clean collection that won't start to grow mold for a long time, even at 75 or 80% relative humidity, may start growing it a lot faster, even down as low as 65%. So keeping your collection clean is good, and obviously increasing air circulation. We all know that decreases the chance, the likelihood of mold growth. So that's a good thing. What if your relative humidity is too low? Well, you can lower the temperature slightly. You can use paper-based housings that buffer relative humidity changes. This is very good news for things like paper collections, because they're the things that okay, let me just finish this relative humidity too low slide, and then I'll go back to the last slide. You can use microclimates within enclosures, where you add a material that is that provides a little extra humidity and keeps it that way. You can use and you obviously. The most obvious thing is you can use humidifiers either through a central system or portable units, but you have to really use those with caution to prevent damage to your building envelope. You don't want to introduce a lot of interior moisture, especially in the winter, in buildings that don't have a good vapor barrier, because you can wreck your walls. Okay, I'm just going to go back to the previous slide, and somebody noticed the little thing about semi-airtight packaging, which I didn't address. In the picture, there's on the left, which is very small, and what I'm looking at, I hope it's larger than what you're looking at, is a picture of it's probably a Tupperware container with the lid that's on loosely, versus on the right where the Tupperware container has the lid on tightly. Tupperware containers, they're good. The plastic tends to be a very good quality inert plastic, and they keep out dust, pests. If they're dark, they keep out light too. And they also create a microclimate inside, which is good, but only if they're well sealed. If they're not well sealed, what you may have is you may get condensation forming, because when it's moist air can get in, and then when the temperature drops, it'll condense. It's not a good, it's better if you're using a container to have an airtight packaging in these circumstances and not semi-airtight. I hope that explains that. It's explained a lot better in Stefan's article, because he had the time to think about what he was writing, unlike me, who is babbling incoherently. Okay, which stop laughing, Alka. Okay. If the relative humidity is fluctuating too much, that's a hard word to say, easier to write. You can try adjusting the temperature or relative humidity if you have them, set points on your central system, if you have a central system. Often, if you've got relative humidity that is fluctuating, a lot of really small fluctuations, which, as I said, may or may not be a problem for your collection, but it certainly is putting stress on your system, and probably costing you money. It's often because the set points are too close together. They may be set at sort of, at 47 and 53 or something like that % relative humidity. And if you broaden them out, have one at 40 and the other at 55, for example, or 45 and 55, that might solve that problem. There may be operations and activities in your museum that are causing fluctuations, that people that are automatically leaving doors open for certain things, or preparing some kind of feast at regular times. There you can look at that, see if you can tie activities to fluctuations, and if the fluctuations are problematic, you may need to change those activities. You can add vestibules. Basically, that's, it's like an airlock, right? If you have a vestibule, a hallway going into your museum from the outside, so that when somebody opens the door, you don't automatically get the dramatically different change in air coming straight in. There's an air block. Okay, hold on. I've got another question. Okay. Somebody's asking about relative humidity, and they're saying that their average temperature is between 17 and 19%, and their relative humidity between 39 and 50%. And they're not quite sure if that means it's too low or not. Actually, no. That's mid-range relative humidity. That would not constitute 39% relative humidity. Does not constitute low relative humidity unless it's. I'm trying to think if there's anything in a collection that might object to 39%, and I can't think of anything right now. So you're safe. Don't panic. In fact, it sounds like the facility is doing quite well. So yeah, vestibules are good if you're getting huge swings in relative humidity, and basically improving the insulation value of your building envelope is a good idea. Oh, I've got to move through this a little bit more quickly. But I've got some more questions. Do certain forms of lighting affect humidity? Yes, lighting will affect humidity in the sense that if you have lighting that produces a lot of heat, it's going to obviously the increase in heat in temperature decreases the relative humidity. The hotter it is, the lower the relative humidity. So you can and obviously the heat is probably not good for the organic materials in your collection as well. So sorry, here I am playing with my technology. It might be a good idea to have a look at your lighting and try and reduce the temperature buildup. How do broader set points for temperature RH reduce the RH fluctuations? That's a very good question. It's got to do with the amount of times that the machinery switches on and off. Basically, it evens out the fluctuations so that they're not quite as frequent and not as severe. It's more to do with frequency than it is the degree of fluctuation in that case. It's a good question. Okay. Other things you can do if the humidity is fluctuating too much, you use paper-based housing to buffer RH. That's a picture of an archival box with tissue paper in it. You can use, especially if you're in a historic house museum, this is really useful to know. You can use your furniture, like your dressers, your chests, things like that were intended to store textiles, use them to store textiles. If they're older, especially if you wrap the textiles in acid-free tissue, it's going to protect them, and it's going to create nice buffering so that the furniture is less likely to crack. And you can create active or passive microenvironments. So here's on the left pictures of what you can display cases with an active microclimate generator, which basically is a machine that will actually pipe in air at a certain relative humidity into your display cases. Or passive microclimates, which are when you use something like silica gel, which has either you use it as a desiccant, which is its natural form. You just put it in and it naturally sucks all the moisture out of the air, which is very nice for metals. Or you can condition it to a certain level, like 40%, 60%, whatever it is that you want, and use it to keep the environment in the display or storage enclosure at exactly the level you want. Yep, and I'm getting short of time. So I was just going to say, if you can buy a type of silica gel, it's called an indicating silica gel, which is color. It'll change color when it's not at the right level of humidity anymore, and you need to recondition it. It tends to be more expensive. My recommendation is to just buy a little bit of that and mix it with the regular stuff, and you get a cheaper indicating silica gel. Climate control in historic buildings. I highly recommend that you go to the resources that I've posted here. There are lots of ideas about how to use the natural climate control that existed in those buildings when they were first built. If they haven't been overly altered, you may be able to get air circulation working the way it used to. Just a warning that a lot of the studies online, if you're Googling, if they come from Europe or the tropics, or if they're dealing with museums in the tropics, they're not necessarily relevant for museum buildings in Canada. So I would stick with the North American ones. And the ones I've posted there are, like I said, they're really useful. That one by Richard Kirshner is not just about climate. It's a fabulous essay on preventive conservation in buildings at his museum in Vermont. All different kinds of buildings, and all of the different stuff he's done over the years. Low budget, highly successful preventive conservation. Okay, sorry. HVAC systems. I'll leave this up. You can, if you want more information about HVAC systems, you can go to this and look. I've just briefly covered some of the issues to think about if you're considering investing in them. And there's some good resources. The Image Permanent Institute, their guide to sustainable preservation practices it's a fancy title, but it's got really good information about HVAC. We had a question about cold storage. There's some resources for you. And my final question, which brings us around to how this fits in with everything else that we do in our museums. How necessary to preservation is climate control? I love this question. It depends. It's about risk assessment. For example, for archival collections in a well-maintained building with good security and a sprinkler system, climate control might be the most important part of your preservation strategy. because your biggest risk to those collections is probably going to be from higher temperatures and higher humidities. But for a mixed collection in a leaky building with an old electrical system and no sprinklers, I would say it's less of a priority. You've got bigger problems. So it's really important to take a risk management approach. It's the sensible way of preserving your collection. It allows you to focus on what matters and not just to go down a checklist of ideal conditions, which is what some of the older literature on preventive conservation or on conservation in general tended to do. It was just a list of you should have this, you should have this, you should have this, you should have this. And rather than saying, okay, what's really the issue in my museum with my collection? So, and the great thing about this, to bring us back to the standards, is that the Standards for Community Museums Ontario is not a list of ideal conditions. They're really guidelines for basic professional practice, and that includes climate control. So I really hope that this has helped to explain some of the more recent developments or the current approaches to climate control in museum, and why there is still a what's the word I'm looking for? A contradiction in a way. There are disparate standards for depending on what kind of institution you are and what kind of institution you're dealing with. So what the good news is that as a community museum, you have the in a way the luxury of doing what's best for your collection and not having to abide by an arbitrary set of guidelines that are imposed by an international body. And that's something that some of the larger institutions like the AGO or even the national museums still have to deal with. So phew. I think that's it for me, unless there's more questions. I'm going to pass it back to Mary.
Great. Well, thank you, Fiona. Thank you for a little straight talk and realism on the subject of climate control this afternoon. That was really fantastic. So we do now have time for some, if anybody has questions for Elke Weinstein, who is a Museum and Heritage Advisor with the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport. If you have any questions specifically about the Ministry's conservation standard or kind of the standards review process in general, please feel free to type them in now. Also, if there are any more questions for Fiona, we can get back to those as well. So I'm going to pass it over to Elke.
Hello. Okay. I just wanted to thank Fiona again. That was a great webinar, and I don't know, there's nothing I can really add unless anybody has specific questions about the standards. The one thing I emphasized last time was about training, and that I'm going to emphasize again. If you don't have training in this, then I would suggest you take an OMA course or another course that you might be able to find. There are I think there's online courses in conservation or risk management. And oh yes, and risk management. I think that's the most important thing, really, is that you have to learn how to basically manage the risks to your collection. And you can do that in some fairly common sense ways, but I think it's better to actually get training to do that. So I think those are the sort of two most important points that I wanted to emphasize. So other than that, turn it over to Mary. Oh, yeah, sorry.
And I am going to pass it back over to Fiona because I think we have another question for her.
Hello again. It is I. Question about where you can get to Michael Henry's document. There was one of the slides. Can I go back? Is that okay, Mary? Oh, yeah, I'll just flick. There we go. It wasn't too far back. Two of his, he's an engineer, by the way. He specializes in museums and in historic buildings, particular, and very practical and lovely man. I'm hoping to get him up here to give a workshop at some point. Every time I sign up for his workshops in the States, they end up getting canceled because not enough people want to go. And I keep saying to him, "Are they crazy? You're so good." Yeah, there are two of the documents right there with the links, and if you Google him and put in historic buildings, museums, historic buildings, you'll probably find more. But there's particularly the understanding, the second one there, understanding the building climate relationship, is a PowerPoint presentation that's where I pulled those lists from. And that, as I said, that Richard Kirshner document, which is unfortunately it's just the text of a presentation. It's missing the photos. I don't know why. If I find out where I can get one with the accompanying photos, then I'll post that as well. But I highly recommend, if you want a very good read about dealing with museums and historic buildings, including things like barns and log cabins, I would go there to that particular link. Oh, and I took my training slide out of this presentation because I knew I was short on time. But there are online courses in museum conservation related issues, including climate control and risk management, from an organization called Museum Classes Online. I think the website is museumclasses.org, or yeah, museumclassesonline.org or museumclasses.org. Anyway, one of the two. I'm developing two courses for them right now, including one on opening and closing seasonal museums. So, but they're not as reasonable as the OMA's offerings. That's the only problem with them. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Mary, unless anybody has any more questions.
All right. Thank you, Fiona, once again for a great presentation today, and thank you, Elka, for your participation, and to the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport for their support of this webinar series and the Ministry staff's active participation. Thank you to everybody who signed in today for your participation. As I mentioned in the beginning and in the chat there, the slides and the recording of the webinar will be posted on the CMOG Standards Resources page of the OMA website shortly, and I'll be sending out a link to the webinar evaluation later today. I'm just going to try and get to my last slide here for a second. There we go. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have some more webinars coming up, and there's a new one to announce coming up on the 25th of July on accessibility in exhibits. The link to registration hasn't been posted yet, but we will get that up as soon as possible, so keep that date in your calendar as well. And we'll be putting it out on the website and in the newsletter. Next week we have a webinar on outcomes-based program planning and evaluation for your programs at your museum. So do come back for that. It'll be with Chris Castle next Thursday. And as everybody keeps talking about training, I just also want to mention that we still do have some space in our artifacts course coming up this August in Thunder Bay. So please do sign up for that if you're interested in getting involved in the certificate in museum studies, learning a bit more about materials, agents of deterioration, and proper artifact handling. So thank you again, everyone, for coming out, and have a great day.